Then the king of Egypt spoke to Shiphrah and Puah, the two midwives who helped the Hebrew woman. When you help the Hebrew woman give birth, he said to them, kill the baby if it is a boy, but if it is a girl, let it live. But the midwives feared God and did not obey the king. Instead, they let the boys live. So the king sent for the midwives and asked them, why are you doing this? Why are you letting the boys live? They answered, the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian woman. They give birth easily, and their babies are born before we get there. Because the midwives were God-fearing, and God was good to them and gave them families of their own. And the Israelites continued to increase and become strong. Finally, the king issued a command to all his people, take every newborn Hebrew baby and throw him into the Nile, but let all the girls live. During this time, a man from the tribe of Levi married a woman of his own tribe. She bore him a son. When she saw what a fine baby he was, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took a basket, made reeds and covered it with tar to make it watertight. She put the baby in it and placed it in tall grass at the edge of the river. The baby's sister stood some distance away to see what would happen. The king's daughter came down to the river to bathe. While her servants walked along the bank, suddenly she noticed the basket in the tall grass and sent a slave woman to get it. The princess opened it and saw a baby boy. He was crying and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. Then his sister asked her, shall I go and call a Hebrew woman to nurse the baby for you? Please do, she answered. So the girl went and brought the baby's own mother. The princess told the woman, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So she took the baby and nursed him. Later, when the child was old enough, she took him to the king's daughter, who adopted him as his own son. She said to herself, I pulled him out of the water, and so I named him Moses.
One of the things that most of you don't know about me is, there's lots of things you don't know about me, but one of my little weaknesses in life, that's how my son began one of his speeches once when he was a kid. He got up and said, my mother has a weakness, and then stopped. And the teacher told me later that she wondered what on earth he was going to come out with as to my weakness. But I love baskets. Now, I have a friend who was a professional basket maker, and over the years, I've bought or been given baskets of all shapes and sizes. And I want to share a couple of baskets with you. Actually, this one she didn't make. This is very special to me because the mother of one of the children I taught, unbeknownst to me, picked some flax from Fernridge School, went home, dyed it, and made this kitty for me. And I just love it. It's very precious. So just put that there. Now, another one I've got is this tiny little basket here. Some of you won't be able to see it. But I bought it in England 10 years ago, and we went to a fair, and I knew there was going to be a basket maker there because I'd seen it in the ad, so I insisted on going to her stall. And I wanted to buy something really little just to remind me. So I saw these little baskets, and I bought two. One for me and one for my friend Heather. And when I went up to the lady to pay for them, I said, these are going back to New Zealand, and one of them's going to my friend. She's a professional basket maker. And she said to me, yes, her name is Heather Shaw. And the woman in England knew Heather. And then I remembered that Heather had gone to England for lessons. So they knew each other. And this little basket was made by a man in Romania. And Heather actually knew him and had spoken with him and met with him. So that's very precious. And just to prove that Heather does make baskets, this is one of them. She made willow baskets. If ever you were over in Otaki, going down the ramp, there was a sign off to the left. It said Heather Shaw Basket Maker. She's the only person who ever got her name on the sign that said basket maker, because there was another basket maker down the street, 2 doors down from her, Eddie. And so she got her name. But there's her basket. Each of Heather's baskets were made with much love, thought, care and detail. She grew the willow herself, she harvested it, and she prepared it, and she was extremely fussy about detail. And her baskets have been sold all over the world because she traded on the net. So it was a business for her. She's a solo mum, she supported 3 children. And she worked jolly hard. And the only reason she gave up was because physically it was so hard on her chest and back muscles. So baskets, my thing. But I'm very aware that baskets are mentioned all through the Bible. And the most obvious example, if you're thinking of baskets in the Bible, I don't know about you, but the first thing I thought of was Moses and the bulrushes. And we've all grown up knowing that story. And each of us in our minds and in our hearts have got this image of a little baby floating in the Nile and the subsequent events which took place. Now, I went on the net to have a look to see sort of what kind of basket it would be, and there were all sorts of pictures, but I got terribly excited when I saw a picture that looked a little like this. Number one, it wasn't a circle, it was a bit like, it was an oval, and it had a lid, okay? But it looked like this. It was made out of reeds and papyrus. This basket is special to me because I bought it for $1 in an op shop a few weeks ago. Got no idea why I bought it, except I loved it. And I thought to myself, I know I'm supposed to be decluttering, but I know I'll find a really good use for it one day. I like that basket. So, yes, we all know the story. But this morning I want to look very closely at the account as it plays a very important part in the history of the Israelite people. There are 4 different people or groups of people, and interestingly they're all women, who are involved in this wonderful part of God's plan for the Hebrew people, the Israelites. We're going to meet the midwives. Jochebed, that's Moses' mother, Miriam, his sister, and the Pharaoh's daughter. God had a plan for each of these people, and we, looking back, are able to see how the plan played out. And Moses owed his life to 5 women. At this point, I want to say, first of all, I didn't have anything to give you to remember. Last time I gave you a little tea light, and I desperately wanted to give you something today, and I thought about it, and I had umpteen options, and in the end, nothing seemed right, and nothing worked out. So I'm really sorry, you've got nothing, no little surprises today, but I want to tell you that the theme of the sharing, and if you just take home 8 words, I'll be happy. Because this is the main point of the story we're going to be looking at. Trust God. Honour God. God is in control. Now, I warn you now that I will be repeating that phrase as often as I can, just so you can take it home and apply it in your life and whatever situations you're facing now, because I can tell you in the last week I've had to hang on to it at one point for grim death. But anyway, trust God, honour God, God is in control. Now we're going to look at the midwives in the story first, because they certainly trust God and honoured God, and he used them as part of his plan to deliver his people from the tyranny of the Pharaohs. Now Puah and Shiphrah lived in dangerous times. For 150 years, foreigners had conquered and oppressed their country. Dynasties had risen and fallen like the waters of the Nile, and now a new Pharaoh had clawed his way into power, and he was going to be ruthless. He didn't trust the remnants of the foreigners still living within his borders. He didn't trust the Hebrew descendants of Joseph and his 12 prolific brothers. He meant to crush them so hard that they could never rise up against him. He drove them into slavery and gave them so much work so that their men would be too tired to make their wives pregnant. But it didn't work. The Hebrew women were fruitful and multiplied. Pharaoh was terrified that the Hebrews would realise their strength and align with his enemies. Now his heart was steeped with evil. He summoned 2 midwives. Go about your work among the Hebrew slaves, he said. Tell them what to eat and how to breathe. Hold their hands through the pains, if you think it's really worth it. And then his eyes grew narrow and his voice grew hard and deep. But when they are delivered, if it is a male child, set it aside to die before its mother knows, the girls may live, but the boys must die. Now, Pharaoh had condemned the Hebrews to worse than genocide. He believed in life after death, at least his life after death, because he intended to live forever in the massive tomb his slaves were building. But in those days, the Hebrews did not believe in life after death. They believed a man lived only as long as his sons' and grandsons' memories. And Pharaoh intended that they'd have no sons, so then they would have no memories. Think about it, it's huge. Now, Puah and Shiphrah were not Hebrew women. Their names are Egyptian, and they mean splendour and beauty. Yet, they worked in the Hebrew slave camps. It couldn't have been for the money, because slaves don't have money. They were the early examples of the kind of people who work with the dispossessed. They'd witnessed the mystery of life and death, and they'd taken the oath of their calling in all ways to serve life. And we all know what happened. They didn't do what the Pharaoh had commanded. So Pharaoh summoned them back to his palace. "Where are the baby boys?" he thundered. "Was I not perfectly clear? My soldiers say you've brought them none. Where are they?" He shook his fist so hard that his double crown nearly fell from his head, and the slaves hiding behind the linen curtain quaked in terror. Puah and Shiphrah quaked too. Of course. But at that new dawn, they'd held new life in their hands, and now they were too exhausted to think past that point. "The Hebrew women are not like us," said Puah. "No," said Shiphrah. "They have their babies so fast that we can't get to them before they're up and back in the kitchens." The two midwives looked at each other and nodded. "They're not like us, great Pharaoh." Can this be true? Pharaoh glared at the priest kneeling at his feet. For though he had fathered many, many children by many, many beautiful wives and concubines, Pharaoh had never troubled himself with the details of childbirth and other female problems. The priest must have shrugged. Like most middle management of his time, he was a eunuch and he didn't know either. "Then go," thundered Pharaoh. "From now on, go faster." And the midwives scuttled from his presence, and indeed they tried. But they always swore they never got to their deliveries in time to deliver death. What can this mean to us? Here and now, and so many years far and beyond anywhere Puah and Shiphrah could imagine. Puah and Shiphrah made God's presence tangible in their world. But if they'd heard us call them prophets, they would have laughed. No, not us. We're too ordinary. It's just that in every birth there comes a moment as if life and death are balanced on a scale, and we chose life. Of course, it would have been easier to have done what Pharaoh said, to leave it to more important people to resolve. But we were all those women had. God gave us opportunities every day, and Shiphrah yawns every night too, to help others. Acting on God's voice was hard work, and so is childbirth, and every mother knows its reward. Then Puah and Shiphrah might look down at their own hands and say, well, it was as if God himself was in labour to give birth to a new world. He couldn't have done it alone. He needed our help. Now, I just want to read to you again, because I know we've had it. I'm not reading don't worry, not the whole lot. Just verses 20 to 22. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. And that's when Pharaoh gave his order for the babies to be thrown into the Nile. So these two midwives were dedicated to life rather than death, and they disobeyed Pharaoh's edict. Their disobedience was the first step in the Exodus. You think about the Exodus story out of Egypt, and in its own way was the first act of rebellion against Pharaoh. Did you notice that God honoured these two women for their faith and trust, and he gave them families of their own, and their names are remembered forever. Trust God. honour God, God is in control. The next person we're going to focus on is Jochebed, a real woman of faith who also trusted God, honoured God, and knew that God was in control of a situation which was absolutely dire. Jochebed means glory of Jehovah, or Jehovah is her glory. She was an Israelite, one of God's chosen people. She was also a member of the tribe of Levi, from which would come the priests and those who would carry out the duties of the tabernacle and later the temple. She was a godly woman who stood for her faith, and she had a relationship with God as her sovereign Lord and King. Now, this is where a basket, sort of a bit like this with a lid, becomes an ark. For a mother to release her child into the hands of strangers is a difficult task, and it takes tremendous faith and trust that our children will be cared for outside of our protective grasp. Jochebed wanted to give her infant son a chance, so she made a basket of papyrus and reeds, and she coated it with tar and pitch. We can only imagine her thoughts and fears, the sadness, the emotional feelings of loss, as she prepared to literally ship him away. Because it would have only taken an ill-timed cry and the Egyptian guards would have discovered her child. She had to go and gather the materials to make the basket. She had to make it knowing full well all the risks involved, and presumably she had to keep this plan a secret, as they were dangerous times. Now, the word for basket in Hebrew is tebah, and the word also appears in Genesis. It is the same word for the ark. It was a tebah that saved Noah and his family and the animals from the great flood. This was a tremendous act of faith and trust in her God. The Nile was full of crocodiles and swift currents. Her precious baby was in treacherous waters. But as I said previously, she trusted God, she honoured God, and she knew that He was in control. And she believed that God would watch over her baby and protect him. Think about it. Must have been terrible as a mother to have to do that. However, we've got Miriam, Moses' older sister, is the next person we're going to meet. Now, she's an interesting character in this chain of events that is orchestrated by God, because God's behind the whole thing, and we can see it unfolding. And she certainly had an interesting life as she travelled through the desert with Moses years later. But for this part, we're just going to focus on her as a child. Ultimately, she was the very protective older sister of a very precious child born to Amram and Jochebed. We already know that they were godly parents who trusted God, honoured God, and knew that God was in control. And Miriam also knew that the king of Egypt hated her people. So her life was a life of fear and uncertainty, as well as, like you can see it, the two sides, because, not easy. Now, I tried to find out how old she was, and I, as a child, when I heard the story, I always imagined that Miriam was about 12 when this happened, because this is my image in my head. Your image is different. But I always imagined she's 12. But when I looked up references, I found out we can assume that Miriam was between 7 and 12 when these events took place. And I guess the actual age, it doesn't really matter. The main thing is that she too trusted God, honoured God, and she knew that God was in control. I made a list of Miriam's qualities and characteristics, and I'm sure you will agree with me. She was protective, bold, capable, intelligent, courageous, enterprising, quick-witted, clever, obedient, sensitive, mature, unselfish, and fearless. These are amazing qualities for a child so young to demonstrate. The survival of the leader of the Exodus, Moses, depended on the courage and ingenuity of his older sister. Her mother must have coached her, and that trust between the mother and the daughter paid off, because Miriam was part of the plan to save a baby's life. I was trying to imagine how Jochebed and Miriam must have felt as they walked to the river. Jochebed must have carried the basket with the baby inside. How did she feel as she fed him for the last time before she lovingly placed him in the basket? Did she dress him in his best gowns? Was he wrapped in a special blanket? Her heart must have been so heavy, and her stomach must have been churning, and it must have seemed an awful long way to the river. They placed the basket in the bulrushes, away from the currents of the mighty Nile, and Jochebed must have walked home heartbroken, but knowing that God was in control. Miriam stayed hidden, watching to see what was about to unfold. They must have known that the Pharaoh's daughter bathed there. We now know what happened, and isn't God's timing perfect? He is never too early, and he is never too late. The Pharaoh's daughter saw the basket and sent her maiden to get it. She opened it and saw the baby crying. It was at that point that Miriam showed great initiative, poise, and intelligence. She fearlessly approached quietly, no stress, no rush. She didn't rush up. She just, with poise, went quietly, under control, and asked, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse your baby for you, nurse the baby for you?" Because, as we know, there's no formula and bottles in those days. Never disclosing by look or word her own relationship with the child, she brought her own mother to Pharaoh's daughter. Now we know that the Pharaoh's daughter named him Moses, which means pulled out of the water. It must have been wonderful for Miriam to know that she was a major part in saving her brother's life. And she had an interest in Moses for the rest of his life, even when he left home to live in the palace. This family had high hopes for a very special baby, and God saved him in a miraculous way. Why? Because these people trusted God, honoured God, and they knew that God was in control. But the story doesn't stop there, because there was a fifth woman in God's plan for the Hebrew people, and it was Pharaoh's daughter. Now, the first thing we learn about her is that she was kind, tender, and compassionate, because her heart was compassionate when she heard the baby crying and she saw him in the basket. Okay? But she was a heathen woman. She was destined to be the woman who would save a baby from a terrible death, care for him, although he was a Hebrew, and lay the foundation of his great work for God, because God had this all under control. Pharaoh's daughter was an Egyptian, an idolater, who worshipped the sun. Yet in the motherhood of the child that she delivered from the Nile and named Moses, she revealed that she was above being a pagan, even above the cruelty of her pagan parent. At the risk of jeopardising her favour with her father, who had decreed the drowning of all male Hebrew babies, she felt it was too cruel to murder the precious bundle of humanity found in the bulrushes. As an Egyptian woman, the princess enjoyed great liberty. Along with her female attendants, she'd come to that reserved part of the Nile to wash, seeing its waters were considered to be healthy. Seeing the small basket, the Pharaoh's daughter sent one of her maidens to fetch it. When she opened it, she saw the lovely child, and she had compassion on him, in spite of the fact he was one of the Hebrews' children whom her despot father had ordered to be killed. The baby wept, and his tears opened a well of compassion in her heart. With her love, she mingled concern for the baby's welfare, and as we've seen, his own mother was secured as his nurse until he was weaned. Got to remember, Pharaoh's daughter did not look upon little Moses as a delightful little plaything for the palace, but she looked on him as someone for whom she had risked her own life. Think of what would have happened if Pharaoh's daughter had not come to the waters at the hour she did. God is in control. The baby may have been destroyed in some way. Could easily have been eaten by a crocodile, floated off downstream. Who knows? Doesn't bear thinking about. But God used a pagan princess to deliver the child who was going to become one of his greatest heroes. Because for 40 years, Moses was cared for and educated as the son of Pharaoh's daughter, having all the privileges of a son at the royal court. Now, later on in the New Testament, it says in Acts 7:22, Stephen declared that Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds. Now, for those 40 years that Moses lived in the palace, he was surrounded with all the wealth and luxury of the Pharaoh's court. He was taught to speak and write the Egyptian language correctly. Attention would have been given to the grace of style, which was later to guide Moses as the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible. Isn't God wonderful? Moses didn't know when he was learning to read and write as a child that one day he'd be writing books that we read now. It's amazing. God's in control. I'm like, wow, that is so cool. His education would, and this is really cool, his education would have also included arithmetic and geometry, something in which Egyptians, even in that far-off age, were most proficient. Moses also acquired a knowledge of Egyptian law, which he put to good use when he came to write the Mosaic law. And from the priests of religion, he learned much about religious morality. Thus, in the education that the princess gave her adopted son, we've got evidence of God's overruling providence in the shaping of the future of Israel's great leader. Amazing, eh? It's like, wow. These people, all these women, the 2 midwives, Puah and Shiphrah, Jochebed, Miriam, the Pharaoh's daughter, we don't know her name. Isn't that interesting? We don't know her name, but we know the name of the 2 midwives. All the, and even when I thought about it, even the maidens, the Pharaoh's daughter's maidens who went and got the basket and took it to her, they were all connected in some way. They had a part to play in a small basket that was woven with love, hope, tears, prayers, and a sure foundation of faith, which believed in the truth of trusting God, honouring God, and knowing that God is in control. And I reckon that we can take those words for ourselves. Trust God, honour God. God is in control. He was in control of that whole situation. We all know that Moses spent 40 years in the palace and then 40 years in the desert being a sheep farmer and then 40 years leading the children out of Israel. Because God had a plan for that little baby and he never intended for that child to be killed by a despot, Pharaoh. Amen.